This unit name is Measuring Variables. In order to know the current situation and needs of psychologists in European schools, we also need to obtain information on their status before the pandemic caused by the COVID-19. In this way, we would analyze the real needs and the changes caused in the functions and interventions tools needed at present in order to define the psychological actions necessary to address the care needs coming from the COVID-19 to the present. So, in this section, I am going to explain the specific information collected from the European schools. To select the measurements variables and the important information we need to collect, we need to figure out what to measure, how to measure it, and what to do to ensure the quality of the data, that it corresponds as closely as possible to the reality. In other words, the whole process from deciding which variables are going to be collected to getting them into a coded database ready for the analysis. This includes many processes, which are very interrelated, and which we are going to separate in a schematic way for didactic purposes, trying to answer the following questions. What variables are we going to measure? In this section, this is the section of the variables. What and how are we going to measure in each variable? That means clarifying variables, defining and measuring a skill. Where are we going to collect the data from and how? Those are the sources of information and measuring instruments: observation, questionnaires, interviews, etc. A brief description of the organization of the fieldwork. What can we do to ensure that the data to be analyzed are of high quality? That means the quality of the data obtained. How can we ensure that all of the above will be carried out in a uniform and standardized way? We do it through the data collection sheets, procedures manuals, and also the pilot testing. What will we do with the data once it is collected until it is available for the analysis? We will proceed the data processing. All in all, what is the reliability and validity of these measurements? As mentioned, the variables of the project were selected according to their relevance to achieve the objectives of the study. Once they were selected, an operational definition of each of them was made to ensure the correct measurement of all of them. Each of the variables measured in the study were clearly and explicitly defined. You may wonder what the operational definition is. Well, it refers to the definition of the characteristics that we actually measure. It is verbalized in terms of objectively observable facts, being clear and explicit enough to prevent ambiguities. When it is intended to obtain information that can be directly compared with the results of other studies, it is important to take the precaution of using the same operating configurations as them. Many times, the differences between studies are simply due to the fact that they have used different operational definitions. Once the variables were established, it was determined that it would be important to collect information on the state of psychologists in schools before, during, and also after COVID-19, to compare the information and establish more precisely the possible interventions needed. Before COVID, the following variables were measured: organizational structure and care protocols applied in the centers, type of psychological intervention, situation of the role of the psychologist in schools. For the variable organizational structure and care protocols applied in the centers, the type of information collected was the following: the number of the psychologists in the school, the ratio of students per psychologist, the intervention protocol established and the staff involved, school organization chart, internal policies and strategy plans for intervention. And on the other hand, for the variable of type of psychological intervention, the type of information collected was the following: the areas of intervention carried out by the psychologist, for example, cyberbullying, cultural diversity, stress, etc. The type of intervention carried out by the psychologist, such as the assessment and treatment, group, individual, by other professionals, etc., and the assessment tools, cognitive, emotional, and psychosocial. Then we have also the strategies and tools used by the psychologist in his or her intervention, and information collected from the students by the psychologist. Then, for the variable situation of the role of the psychologist in schools, the type of information collected was the following: benefits of the psychologist's role in the schools, shortcomings of the school psychologist in his or her daily work in school. Regarding the information collected during COVID, the following variables were measured: organizational structure and care protocols applied in the centers, type of psychological intervention, and status of the school psychologist role. For the organizational structure and care protocols applied in the centers variable, the type of information collected was the following: the number of psychologists in the school, the ratio of students per psychologist, and the intervention protocol established and the staff involved, school organization chart, internal policies, and strategic plans for intervention. On the other hand, for the type of psychological intervention variable, the type of information collected was as follows: the different areas of intervention carried out by the psychologist, the types of intervention carried out by the psychologist, the strategies and tools used by the psychologist in his/her intervention, the information collected from students by the psychologist, which was the impact of the pandemic on the school, closure of classrooms, health security measurements, etc. Also the characteristics of the therapeutical care during the pandemic, where care activities were carried out during the pandemic, and how were care activities carried out and with what instruments. And finally, new problems, needs of learners that have arisen with the situation resulting from COVID-19. And finally, for the variable status of the school psychologist's role in schools, the following information was collected: the difficulties and shortcomings incurred during the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition, information was collected on the present situation of psychologists, and for this the information was collected was related to the main needs and also the proposals for future improvements. On the most committed decisions of this study refers to determine its scope. By scope, we refer to the geographical area covered and the size of the sample. In this type of study, absolutely linked to reality, any empirical experiment implies a process of data collection, which is all the more complex when the greater the geographical space that is intended to be covered, and the greater the number of individuals that make up the sample. Thus, the limitations regarding the scope of this study are directly related to the feasibility and availability of resources. That is why, according to the resources available in this case, the geographical scope of all the participating countries was analyzed, distributed through the European geographical area, the results being directly applicable to all the different countries that make up the European Union, according to an exhaustive study based on the results obtained in the study carried out. With all this data collected, very valuable information was obtained that gives tools, strategies, and measurements methods for the evaluation of the school psychologists and their work, in order to determine the impact of their actions, but also in order to motivate. This analysis of competencies provides instructions for services that should be applied more frequently. In example, the evaluation of stress in the teaching personnel, analysis of team group, support of multiculturalism, support of students with disabilities, etc. The standardization of psychological services at international level will provide a clear framework for the implementation of activities for safeguarding psychological health of the students, teachers, and also their families. The definition of a clear framework, its regulation and measurement of the impact of psychologists will sustain, moreover, the category of psychological at professional level and their valorization.